The wagon disappeared into the shimmering heat, and 8-year-old Lily Rowan didn't cry. She stood alone on that Dakota trail with dust settling on her worn boots, clutching a ragged doll with one button eye, watching the only family she'd ever known abandon her without a backward glance. The sun beat down merciless and indifferent. Buzzards circled overhead, and in that moment, survival became a question no child should have to answer alone. What happened next would change 3 lives forever and prove that family isn't always born from blood. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lily's story travels. And if this opening grabbed you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The Dakota Territory stretched endless and indifferent under the August sun of 1885, a vast canvas of prairie grass and dust that swallowed lives as easily as it swallowed sound. The trail wound through it like a scar, rutted, dry, marked by the passage of countless wagons heading west toward promises that most would never keep. Lily Rowan stood exactly where they'd left her. Her boots were too big, inherited from a cousin who'd outgrown them, and they made soft scuffing sounds when she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The hem of her calico dress was torn, stained with travel and neglect, and her dark hair hung in tangled braids that hadn't been properly combed in weeks. She held her doll, a sad, lumpy thing with one button eye and stuffing leaking from a seam, pressed against her chest like a talisman. The wagon had disappeared 15 minutes ago, maybe 20. Time moved differently when you were 8 years old and utterly alone. She'd watched it go without crying, though her throat had closed up tight and her eyes had burned. Her stepmother's face had been turned deliberately away, profile sharp against the canvas cover. Her stepfather hadn't looked back at all, just snapped the reins and kept the mules moving west, toward Oregon, toward the new life they'd planned that had no room for a child who wasn't theirs by blood. "You'll be fine," her stepmother had said, voice flat and final as she'd set Lily's small bundle on the ground. "Someone will come along. Trails like this, there's always someone." But there wasn't always someone. Lily knew that much, even at 8. She'd seen the graves along the trail, small ones sometimes, marked with crude crosses or cairns of stone. She'd heard the stories whispered around campfires about children lost, stolen, forgotten. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shortened and disappeared. Heat rose from the packed earth in visible waves, and the horizon shimmered like water that wasn't there. Lily's lips were dry. She'd had water that morning, a few sips from the canteen her stepmother had allowed before taking it back. Her stomach was empty except for a piece of hardtack she'd saved from yesterday. And she'd eaten that hours ago, before they'd stopped, before the conversation she'd pretended not to understand. "Can't afford another mouth, not where we're going." "She's not our responsibility, never was." Her real mama's been dead 3 years. No one's coming to claim her. Lily had known then, in the way children know things they're not supposed to. She'd packed her doll carefully that morning, said nothing when her stepmother's eyes had slid past her at breakfast, stayed quiet during the long ride until the wagon had stopped and she'd been told to get down. Now she stood in the middle of nowhere with a doll and a bundle that contained one extra dress, a tin cup, and a tarnished silver locket that had belonged to her mother, the only thing of value she owned, hidden in the deepest corner of the cloth. She could hear insects buzzing in the grass. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, sharp and hungry. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and sage, and something else. Something wild that made the hair on her arms stand up despite the heat. Lily turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty land. There were no trees, no shelter, no sign of habitation in any direction. Just grass and sky, and the trail cutting through it like a promise of direction that meant nothing if you had nowhere to go. She should move, she thought. Stay by the trail, maybe, where people could see her, or find water. There had to be water somewhere, didn't there? But her legs felt heavy, and the reality of her situation was settling over her like a weight she didn't know how to carry. She was alone. Actually, completely alone. The thought tried to become fear, but Lily pushed it down the way she'd learned to push down lots of things. Fear didn't help. Crying didn't help. Begging hadn't helped when she'd asked, very quietly, if she could please stay with them. If she could please not be a burden, if she could work harder and eat less and be better. Her stepmother's eyes had gone cold and distant. Some things just aren't meant to be, child. The sun beat down. Lily's shadow was a small, dark puddle at her feet. She was just considering whether to sit down or keep standing when she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Her heart jumped, caught between hope and terror. Someone coming could mean rescue. It could also mean something much worse. She'd heard stories about that too. The rider appeared as a silhouette first, wavering in the heat shimmer, gradually solidifying into the shape of a man on a large horse, moving at an easy lope that suggested no particular hurry. As he drew closer, Lily could make out more details. Dark hat, broad shoulders, a rider who sat his horse like he and the animal were parts of the same organism. The horse was a big bay gelding, well kept and strong. The man wore range clothes, denim trousers, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a leather vest that had seen hard use but wasn't shabby. He had a weathered face, somewhere between 30 and 40, with deep-set eyes that took in the world with careful assessment. He saw her from 30 yards away and didn't change his pace, just kept coming at that same steady lope until he was close enough that Lily had to tilt her head back to look up at him. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. His eyes were gray, she noticed, like winter sky, and they didn't miss much. They catalogued her torn dress, her oversized boots, the doll clutched against her chest, the small bundle at her feet. They noted the fresh wagon tracks heading west and the smaller tracks, hers, that stopped right here and went nowhere. Water? His voice was low, roughened by sun and wind. Lily shook her head. The man swung down from his saddle with an ease that spoke of decades in the saddle. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate well, and he moved with a kind of measured economy that suggested he didn't waste motion or words. From his saddlebag, he produced a canteen, uncorked it, and held it out. "Drink slow," he said. Lily took the canteen with both hands, had to set her doll down carefully to do it, and drank. The water was warm but clean, and it eased the ache in her throat. She followed his instruction and drank slowly, though everything in her wanted to gulp. When she lowered the canteen, the man was looking west, following the line of wagon tracks with his eyes. His jaw was tight, a muscle working there like he was chewing on words he'd decided not to say. "They leave you deliberate?" he asked finally, still not looking at her. Lily nodded. Her voice came out small and rusty. "Yes, sir." "How long ago?" "Don't know exactly. Before the sun was highest." The man nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He turned his attention back to her, and those gray eyes were sharp but not unkind. "You know where they were headed?" "Oregon Territory, Willamette Valley." "And they didn't want you along?" It wasn't a question, but Lily answered anyway. "No, sir, I'm not. I was my mama's, but she died. They were just keeping me because there wasn't nobody else. But now they said they can't afford another mouth, not where they're going." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flash of something that might have been anger or might have been a deeper, older pain. "What's your name?" "Lily Rowan, sir." "How old are you, Lily Rowan?" 8, almost 9. "Almost 9, he repeated, and there was a weight to the way he said it, like those words meant more than they should. He looked west again, and Lily wondered if he was thinking about riding after the wagon, about forcing them to take her back. The thought made her stomach clench with something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite dread. But the man shook his head slightly, as if answering a question he'd asked himself, and looked back at her. "My name's Caleb Holt. I've got a ranch about 8 miles north of here, Red Willow Ranch. You know what that means?" Lily shook her head. "Means I've got land, cattle, a house, means I've got resources." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "Means I've got options to offer you, if you're interested in hearing them." "Options, sir?" "Option 1. I take you to the nearest town, which is Redemption Creek, about 20 miles east. There's a sheriff there, and a church, and probably some family that would take you in, maybe." His tone suggested he didn't think much of that, maybe. "Option 2, you come to Red Willow with me, at least for tonight. Get fed, get cleaned up, sleep in a real bed. Then tomorrow, if you want, I can take you to Redemption Creek anyway. Or we can talk about other possibilities." Lily looked up at him, trying to read his face, trying to understand what he was really offering. She'd learned to be wary of adults, of their promises and their changing moods. But there was something steady about Caleb Holt, something that felt like bedrock under shifting sand. "Why would you help me?" she asked, the question coming out before she could stop it. Caleb's mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "That's a smart question. Shows you're thinking." He crouched down, bringing himself closer to her eye level, and his voice dropped lower, more intimate. "Truth is, Lily, I don't have a good answer that'll make sense to you right now. Let's just say I know what it's like to be left behind. And I know what it's like when someone gives you a choice when you thought you didn't have any. So I'm giving you one. You can trust me for tonight, or you can take your chances out here on your own, or I can take you to Redemption Creek right now. Your choice." The word hung in the air between them. Choice. It was something Lily hadn't had in a long time, maybe ever. Choices were things adults made while children waited to see how those choices would affect them. She looked at Caleb Holt's weathered face, at the gray eyes that held steady on hers without wavering, at the strong hands resting loose on his knees. She looked at his horse, at the good leather of his saddle, at the rifle in its scabbard, and the coiled rope, and the general competence that radiated from him like heat. Then she looked down at her doll, at the bundle at her feet, at her own thin arms and dirty dress, and 2 big boots. "I'll come to your ranch," she said quietly, "if that's really all right." Caleb nodded once, decisive. "It's all right." He stood, picked up her bundle with one hand, and secured it to his saddle. Then he swung up onto his horse and reached down. "Give me your hand." Lily clutched her doll tighter with one arm and reached up with the other. Caleb's grip was firm and warm as he pulled her up effortlessly, settling her in front of him on the saddle. His arm came around her, steady and secure, and he gathered the reins. "Hold on to your doll," he said, "and don't worry about falling. I've got you." The horse started forward at an easy walk, turning north off the main trail onto a narrower path that wound through the prairie grass. Lily sat stiff at first, unused to the height and motion, but gradually the rhythm of the horse's gait and the security of Caleb's arm around her middle started to ease the terrible tension that had been coiling in her chest since morning. They rode in silence for a long time. The sun had started its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the grass gold and amber. The air smelled like dust and horse, and something green that Lily couldn't name. Above them, the sky was so blue it hurt to look at it directly. "You hungry?" Caleb asked eventually. "Yes, sir." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a piece of jerky. Good quality, not too salty. "This'll hold you till we get home. There'll be a proper meal then." Lily took the jerky and gnawed on it carefully. It was tough but flavorful, and it helped the hollow feeling in her stomach. "Thank you, sir. You can call me Caleb, or Mr. Holt if you're more comfortable with that, but you don't need to sir me every sentence." Yes, Mr. Holt." She felt rather than saw his smile. "That'll do." The prairie gradually gave way to more varied terrain, gentle rises and falls, scattered groves of cottonwood marking where water ran, rocky outcroppings that broke the monotony of grass. In the distance, Lily could see darker shapes that might have been hills or low mountains, hazy with distance. "Is Red Willow Ranch big?" she asked hesitantly. "Fair-sized, about 3,000 acres, give or take. We run about 800 head of cattle, plus horses. It's not the biggest operation in the territory, but it's profitable and well-managed." Lily tried to imagine 3,000 acres and couldn't. Numbers that big didn't mean anything to her. "Do you live there alone?" "No." Caleb's voice changed slightly, warmed. "I've got a partner, Margaret Holt. We've run the ranch together for about 5 years now." "Is she your wife?" "No, we're business partners, close friends. It's an arrangement that works for both of us." Lily puzzled over that. In her experience, men and women lived together as husband and wife, or they didn't live together at all. But she was too tired and too grateful to question it further. The sun was touching the horizon when buildings came into view, a cluster of structures that resolved gradually into a substantial ranch complex. There was a large main house, 2 stories with a wide porch, built of good timber and painted white. Behind it stood a massive barn, several outbuildings, corrals with horses, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the golden light. It was the most beautiful thing Lily had ever seen. That's Red Willow, Caleb said quietly. Home. As they rode into the yard, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was tall, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and a face that was handsome rather than pretty. Strong bones, intelligent eyes, a mouth that looked like it smiled often but wasn't smiling now. She took in the scene quickly, Caleb, the child in front of him, the small bundle, and her expression shifted from curious to concerned. Caleb, she said as he reined in the horse. What's happened? Found her on the south trail, Caleb said, swinging down and then lifting Lily carefully to the ground. Abandoned, deliberately. The woman's face hardened. Lord, help us. She crouched down, bringing herself to Lily's level, and her voice gentled. Hello, sweetheart. I'm Margaret Holt. You look exhausted. Are you hurt anywhere? Lily shook her head. No, ma'am, just tired and hungry. Well, we can fix both of those things right now. Margaret stood and laid a hand on Lily's shoulder, warm, steady, grounding. Caleb, take care of Jasper. I'll get this child fed and cleaned up. She's had some jerky and water, but that's all since morning, Caleb said, handing Margaret Lily's bundle. His eyes met Margaret's over Lily's head, and something passed between them. Understanding, decision, commitment. Her name's Lily Rowan. She's 8, almost 9. Lily. Margaret tested the name, then smiled down at her. That's a pretty name. Come on, honey. Let's get you inside. The house was clean and well kept, with good furniture and colorful rugs on polished wood floors. It smelled like bread and coffee and something savory cooking. Margaret led Lily through a front room with a stone fireplace and comfortable chairs, down a hallway, and into a kitchen that was clearly the heart of the home. Sit, Margaret said, pulling out a chair at a large wooden table. I've got stew that's been simmering all day and fresh bread from this morning. Lily sat, setting her doll carefully on the table beside her. Margaret moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, ladling thick beef stew into a deep bowl, cutting generous slices of bread, pouring cold milk from a pitcher. She set the food in front of Lily and then sat down across from her, watching with gentle concern. Go ahead, honey. Eat as much as you want. There's plenty more. Lily ate. She tried to be polite, to eat slowly, but the food was so good and she was so hungry that it was hard not to wolf it down. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, seasoned perfectly, and the bread was soft and buttery. The milk was cold and sweet. Margaret didn't talk while Lily ate, just sat quietly, occasionally refilling the milk glass or offering more bread. It was only when Lily's pace slowed, when the desperate edge of hunger had been blunted, that Margaret spoke again. Can you tell me what happened, sweetheart? Only if you want to, but it might help me understand how to help you. Lily swallowed a mouthful of stew and set down her spoon. The whole story came out in fits and starts. Her mother's death 3 years ago, the step-family that had taken her in out of obligation, the gradual realization that she was a burden they didn't want, the conversation she'd overheard, the wagon stopping, being left behind. Margaret's expression grew increasingly grim as the story unfolded, but she didn't interrupt. When Lily finished, Margaret reached across the table and covered Lily's small hand with her own larger one. That was wrong, she said firmly. What they did was wrong, and cruel, and illegal. Do you understand that? Lily nodded slowly. You didn't deserve that. No child deserves that. Margaret's eyes were fierce now, protective. I don't know what your stepfamily's situation was, and I don't much care. There were other options, legal options, and they chose the cruelest path. That's on them, not you. Something loosened in Lily's chest, something she hadn't realized was wound so tight. They said I wasn't their responsibility. Then they should have found someone who would take that responsibility properly, not leave a child alone in the middle of nowhere. Margaret squeezed her hand gently. But they did, and you ended up here, and now we need to figure out what comes next. The door opened and Caleb came in, having stabled his horse and cleaned up. He'd washed his face and hands, and his hair was damp. He looked tired but satisfied, like a man who'd done good work. She eat? He asked Margaret. 2 bowls and 3 slices of bread, Margaret confirmed. And she's told me what happened. It's about what you figured, I'd guess. Caleb nodded grimly. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. his presence somehow making the room feel safer, more solid. Lily, Margaret and I need to talk about some things. Adult things. Practical things. You look like you're about to fall asleep in that chair, so what I'd like is for Margaret to take you upstairs, get you washed up, and put you to bed in one of the spare rooms. Is that all right with you? You're not going to make me leave? The question came out small, frightened. Not tonight, Caleb said firmly. Tonight, you're staying here, and you're safe. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next, but tonight, you sleep. Fair enough? Lily nodded, relief flooding through her so intensely it made her dizzy. Margaret stood and held out her hand. Come on, honey, let's get you settled. The spare room Margaret led her to was small but comfortable. A real bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the darkening prairie. Margaret helped Lily wash, produced a nightgown that was far too big but clean and soft, and tucked her into bed with a gentleness that made Lily's throat tight. Sleep as long as you need to, Margaret said, smoothing the quilt over her. If you wake up and need anything, Caleb and I are just down the hall. You're not alone, understand? Yes, ma'am. Margaret hesitated, then bent down and pressed a kiss to Lily's forehead, quick, almost tentative, as if unsure of her right to such intimacy. Good night, Lily. Good night, Mrs. Holt, Margaret smiled. You can call me Margaret, honey. Mrs. Holt makes me sound older than I feel. She left, pulling the door mostly closed, but leaving it open a crack so light from the hallway filtered in. Lily lay in the soft bed, clean and fed and warm, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Low voices from downstairs, the creak of floorboards, the distant lowing of cattle. She should have been afraid. She was in a strange place with people she'd just met, but somehow she wasn't. Caleb Holt had given her a choice when she'd had none. Margaret Holt had looked at her like she mattered, like her suffering was worth being angry about. Lily clutched her doll. She'd brought it upstairs with her, couldn't bear to let it out of her sight, and let her eyes drift closed. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been safety. Downstairs, Caleb and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with coffee between them, their voices low and serious. We keep her, Margaret said flatly. It wasn't a question. Caleb rubbed his jaw, thinking. It's not that simple. Legally, she's probably still under the guardianship of that step-family, wherever they are. We'd need to go through proper channels, court, probably, and we don't know if there are other relatives. Don't care, Margaret said, and there was steel in her voice. I know what I saw in that child's eyes, Caleb. She's been unwanted and she knows it. She's learned to make herself small and quiet and easy to forget. That's not a child who'll thrive getting passed around to whoever will tolerate her presence. I'm not arguing with you, Caleb said mildly, just pointing out the complications. Margaret's expression softened slightly. I know, sorry, it's just... When you rode up with her, when I saw how thin she was, how carefully she was holding herself together, as she shook her head, reminded me of someone. Yeah. Caleb's voice was quiet, understanding. They both knew who she meant. Margaret herself, 20 years ago, another unwanted child who'd learned to survive by being invisible. So we talked to Samuel Harding in Redemption Creek. He's dealt with custody cases before. We find out what the legal requirements are, and we meet them. And if that stepfamily comes back for her, Margaret asked, what if they decide they made a mistake, or they want her labor, or... They won't, Caleb said, and his voice carried absolute certainty. They made their choice when they left her on that trail. People like that don't suddenly grow a conscience. But if they do... His eyes went hard. Well, we'll deal with that if it happens. One step at a time. Margaret nodded, reassured. She's a sweet child, scared, but tough. Did you see how she didn't cry? 8 years old and abandoned, and she stood there and made rational decisions. I saw. Let's say, Caleb's mouth quirked. Ask good questions too. Why would you help me? Not many kids that age think to be suspicious of help when they desperately need it. Smart, Margaret agreed. Probably too smart for her own good sometimes. Those are the kids who see and hear things adults don't think they notice. She paused, then asked the question that mattered most. Do you think she'll stay? When we give her the choice tomorrow, properly, Do you think she'll choose this? Caleb considered, thinking of the small, serious child who'd looked up at him with old eyes and a young face. I think she'll stay, he said slowly, because I think she understands the difference between people who help because they want something and people who help because it's right. She's been around the first kind. Maybe for the first time she's met the second. Then we make her understand she's not a burden, Margaret said firmly. We make her understand she's wanted, not tolerated. That this is her home if she wants it, not just a place we're letting her stay until something better comes along. Agreed. Caleb reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand briefly. We'll do right by her, Maggie, whatever it takes. Margaret smiled, the fierce protective expression softening into something gentler. I know we will. We've built something good here, something worth sharing with a child who needs it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd built a life together based on respect and shared purpose, now contemplating expanding that life to include a child who'd been left behind by people who should have protected her. Upstairs, Lily slept deeply for the first time in months, unaware that two strangers were already planning a future that included her not as an obligation, but as a gift. The night settled over Red Willow Ranch, vast and star-filled and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring decisions and complications and the hard work of building trust. But tonight, a child who'd been abandoned had found shelter, and two adults who'd built their lives on hard-won stability were about to discover that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose. Morning came to Red Willow Ranch with the soft gray light of pre-dawn, the kind that turned the prairie grass silver and made the world feel hushed and new. Lily woke slowly, confused at first by the softness of the mattress beneath her, the clean smell of the sheets, the warmth of the quilt. Then memory returned, the wagon disappearing, Caleb Holt on his horse, Margaret's gentle hands, the bowl of stew, this room. She sat up carefully, clutching her doll, and looked around the small bedroom in the fuller light of morning. Everything was still there, the washstand, the chest of drawers, the window with its simple curtains. Real, not a dream born of desperate hope. From downstairs came the muted sounds of people moving, the clatter of dishes, voices too low to make out words. Lily slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor, and padded to the window. The view took her breath away, rolling prairie stretching to distant hills, the sky enormous and cloudless, cattle grazing in near pastures, horses moving in corrals. In the growing light, Red Willow Ranch looked even more substantial than it had last night, more permanent, more like the kind of place that could withstand anything. A soft knock on the door made her turn. "Lily?" Margaret's voice came through, gentle. "Are you awake, honey?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret opened the door, carrying folded clothes over one arm. She was already dressed for the day in a practical split-riding skirt and a simple blouse, her hair neatly pinned. She smiled when she saw Lily standing by the window. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am. Better than in a long time." "Good." Margaret set the clothes on the bed, a simple dress in dark blue cotton, stockings, undergarments. "These were mine when I was about your age. I've been saving them, not quite sure why, but now I'm glad I did. They should fit you pretty well. Why don't you get dressed, then come down to the kitchen? We've got breakfast, and then we need to have that talk Caleb mentioned last night." Lily's stomach tightened with anxiety. "Am I leaving today?" Margaret's expression softened immediately. She crossed to Lily and crouched down, bringing their faces level. "That depends entirely on what you want, sweetheart. Nobody's making you do anything, but we do need to talk about options and what's legal and proper. Understand?" "I think so." "Then get dressed and come down. And Lily?" Margaret waited until the girl met her eyes. "Whatever happens, you're safe here today. That's a promise." After Margaret left, Lily dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes. The dress fit reasonably well, a little long, but not impossibly so. The fabric was soft from many washings, and it smelled like lavender and sunshine. Having clean clothes that fit properly made her feel more like a person and less like a burden to be shuffled around. She made the bed carefully, smoothing the quilt the way her mother had taught her years ago, and carried her doll downstairs. The kitchen was bright with morning sun streaming through windows, and the smells of coffee and bacon and fresh biscuits made her mouth water despite her nervousness. Caleb sat at the table with a cup of coffee, already dressed for the day's work in denim and worn leather. He looked up when Lily entered and nodded approvingly. "Morning. You look rested." "Morning, Mr. Holt." Lily hesitated in the doorway until Margaret turned from the stove and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, honey. Hungry?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret served breakfast: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, fluffy biscuits with butter, and honey, more cold milk. Lily ate more slowly this morning, trying to remember her manners, while Caleb and Margaret kept the conversation light. They talked about ranch business, about a horse that was due to foal soon, about repairs needed on the south fence. Normal things. Family things. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, Caleb refilled his coffee cup and Margaret sat down with tea. The atmosphere shifted subtly, becoming more serious without being frightening. "Lily," Caleb began, his voice steady and direct, "Margaret and I talked last night after you went to bed. We need to explain some things to you, and then we need to know what you want. Can you listen for a bit?" Lily nodded, her hands folded tight in her lap. "What your stepfamily did, leaving you on that trail, was illegal," Caleb said. "They were your legal guardians, whether they wanted to be or not, and they had responsibilities under the law. Abandoning a child is a crime." "They probably thought nobody would ever know," Margaret added, her voice hard. "They probably thought you'd end up dead or taken in by someone who wouldn't ask questions, and they'd just disappear into Oregon territory where nobody could trace them." Lily had suspected as much, but hearing it said aloud made it real in a new way. "Are you going to report them? To the law?" Caleb and Margaret exchanged a glance. "That's complicated," Caleb said carefully. "We could, and maybe we should. But doing that would start a whole legal process that might not end the way any of us want. It would mean sheriffs and courts, and possibly sending you to an orphanage while things got sorted out. There's a better way," Margaret said firmly. "A legal way that puts you first instead of putting punishment first." Caleb leaned forward, his gray eyes serious. "Here's what we're proposing if you're willing. There's a lawyer in Redemption Creek named Samuel Harding. He's a good man, fair and knowledgeable about territorial law. We can go see him, explain the situation, and file for legal guardianship of you. It would make Margaret and me your official guardians until you're grown." "But only if that's what you want," Margaret interjected quickly. "This is your choice, Lily. If you'd rather we take you to town and help you find another family, we will. If you want us to try to track down relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents, we can do that too. But if you want to stay here at Red Willow, we want that as well." Lily looked between them, these two strangers who'd fed her and clothed her and were offering her something she'd barely dared to hope for. "Why?" she asked, the question coming from somewhere deep and honest. "Why would you want me? You don't know me. I can't work much yet. I'm not big enough. I'd cost money to feed and clothe. Why would you take on that burden?" Caleb's expression flickered with something that might have been pain or memory. "Because you're not a burden, Lily. You're a child who deserves a home and people who'll look after you properly. And because, he paused, choosing words carefully. "Because Margaret and I built this ranch together, built a good life, and we've got more than we need for just the two of us. Sharing that with someone who needs it, that's not a burden, that's a privilege." "I was you once," Margaret said quietly. "Not exactly the same circumstances, but close enough. I was 12 when I ended up on my own. Nobody wanting me, getting passed around like an inconvenient package. I survived, but just barely, and it took me years to believe I was worth anything. I look at you, and I see that same careful way of holding yourself, that same fear of being too much trouble. I don't want you to spend the next 10 years learning to survive. I want you to learn to thrive." Lily's throat was tight, her eyes burning. "But what if I'm not? What if I can't be what you want?" "We don't want you to be anything except yourself," Caleb said firmly. "We're not expecting you to fill some hole in our lives or be grateful every minute or earn your place here. You'd be part of this family, the family we choose to make, and that means you belong here just by being you." Margaret reached across the table and took Lily's hand. "I know it's scary to trust people when you've been let down before. I know it feels safer to expect nothing, so you can't be disappointed. But sweetheart, Sometimes you have to take a chance on people who might actually come through for you. Lily looked down at Margaret's hand covering hers, strong, work-roughened, warm. She thought about the wagon disappearing yesterday, about the long stretch of empty trail, about the terrible certainty that she was alone. Then she thought about Caleb stopping, offering water, giving her choices. She thought about Margaret's fierce anger on her behalf, about the clean clothes and the soft bed and the way they both looked at her like she mattered. "I want to stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you'll really have me, I want to stay here." Margaret's eyes went bright with unshed tears, but she smiled. "Then we'll make it legal and proper. We'll go to Redemption Creek today, talk to Samuel Harding, and start the process." "It might take a few weeks," Caleb cautioned. "There'll be paperwork and probably a hearing before a judge. But territorial law is pretty clear about abandoned children. Courts generally favor placement with willing guardians who have the means to provide proper care, especially when the child agrees to the arrangement." "What if my stepfamily comes back?" Lily asked, voicing her deepest fear. Caleb's expression went hard. "If they come back, they'll have to explain to a judge why they abandoned an 8-year-old child on an empty trail. But I don't think that conversation would go well for them. And even if they tried to reclaim guardianship, you'd have a say. Judges listen to children, especially children old enough to articulate their preferences clearly." The tension that had been coiled in Lily's chest since yesterday began very slowly to unwind. "When would we go to town?" "Today," Margaret said decisively. "No point waiting. The sooner we start the legal process, the sooner it's settled. Besides, you'll need proper clothes, things that actually fit you, and boots that aren't 3 sizes too big." An hour later, they were riding toward Redemption Creek in a well-sprung wagon, Caleb at the reins and Margaret beside him with Lily between them. The morning had warmed into a beautiful late summer day, the kind where the sky seemed impossibly vast and the prairie stretched endless in all directions. Lily sat quietly, watching the land roll past, still half afraid that this would all dissolve like morning mist. "Tell me about Red Willow," she said after a while, needing to fill the silence with something besides her own anxious thoughts. Caleb glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Well," he said, "I came to Dakota Territory about 8 years ago with money from selling my family's farm back in Ohio. Bought the land, built the house and barn, started building a herd. It was hard going at first, one man can only do so much, and I was learning ranching as I went. Then I showed up," Margaret said with a slight smile, "about 3 years into his venture, looking for work and a place to start over. I'd been working as a hired hand on a ranch down in Kansas, but the owner died and his sons didn't want a woman working cattle. Caleb needed help, I needed a job, and we struck a deal." "What kind of deal?" Lily asked, curious despite her nervousness. "Partnership," Caleb said simply. "She'd work as my ranch foreman, managing the hands, organizing the operations. And in return, she'd get a percentage of the profits and equal say in how the ranch was run. It was unusual, but it made sense for both of us." "People talked," Margaret said dryly. "Still do, sometimes. A man and a woman living together, not married. But we made it clear from the start that ours was a business arrangement, and we run the ranch too well for anyone to seriously complain. We employ local men, we pay fair wages, we're honest in our dealings. That counts for more than gossip. And it works because we respect each other," Caleb added. "We're partners in every sense, equals. That's not something you find often, especially between men and women in this territory." Lily absorbed this, trying to understand. In her limited experience, families followed certain patterns: husband, wife, children. But Caleb and Margaret had built something different, something based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than romance or obligation. It was strange, but there was something appealing about it too, honest and straightforward in a way that traditional arrangements often weren't. "Will people think it's strange that you're taking me in?" she asked quietly. "Probably," Margaret said, "but they'll think it's strange in a good way. Look at Caleb Holt and Margaret Holt taking in that poor abandoned child. It'll actually make us seem more respectable, not less." Redemption Creek appeared on the horizon gradually. First church steeples and the tops of taller buildings, then the full sprawl of a territorial town. It wasn't large, maybe 1,000 people, but it was substantial, with a wide main street lined with shops and businesses, cross streets with houses, and the general bustle of frontier commerce. People moved along wooden sidewalks. Horses stood hitched to rails, wagons loaded and unloaded goods. Caleb guided their wagon to a stop in front of a neat building with a painted sign, Samuel Harding, Attorney at Law. "Wait here a moment," he said, swinging down. "Let me make sure he's available." He disappeared inside while Margaret and Lily waited in the wagon. Lily watched the people moving past, women in good dresses, men in business suits or range clothes, children running errands. Normal life, going on as it always had, indifferent to her personal crisis. Caleb emerged after a few minutes, nodding. "He can see us now." Samuel Harding's office was lined with law books and smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. The lawyer himself was a spare man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He shook hands with Caleb and Margaret, then looked down at Lily with unexpected gentleness. "And you must be the young lady at the center of this situation," he said. "Have a seat, all of you. Let's hear the whole story." They told it, Caleb recounting how he'd found Lily, Margaret describing the child's account of her abandonment, Lily herself answering questions about her stepfamily and her mother's death. Harding listened without interrupting, making occasional notes with a fountain pen. When they finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers, thinking. "It's a clear case of criminal abandonment," he said finally. "If you wanted to pursue charges, we could probably track that family down eventually and prosecute, but that's not what's best for Lily," Margaret said firmly. "No," Harding agreed, "it's not. Dragging a child through a criminal trial, forcing her to testify against people who were her guardians, even bad ones, that's traumatic and uncertain. Better to focus on her future rather than punishing their past." "Can we file for guardianship?" Caleb asked. "Absolutely. In fact, given the circumstances, it should be relatively straightforward." Harding pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began making notes. "You'll need to petition the court, which I can help you draft today. There will be a hearing probably in 2 or 3 weeks, depending on Judge Morrison's schedule, where you'll present your case. The judge will want to verify that you have the means to care for a child, that your home is suitable, and that the child consents to the arrangement." He looked at Lily. "Young lady, do you understand what guardianship means?" "I think so, sir. It means Mr. Holt and Mrs. Holt would be legally responsible for me until I'm grown." "That's exactly right. They'd have the authority to make decisions about your education, your health, your welfare. They'd be your legal guardians in every practical sense. Is that what you want?" Lily looked at Caleb and Margaret. These two people who'd appeared in her life less than 24 hours ago and were already offering her more stability than she'd had in years. "Yes, sir, that's what I want." Harding nodded, satisfied. "Then we'll proceed. I'll need some information from you both." He addressed Caleb and Margaret. "About your financial situation, the ranch, your ability to provide for a child. I'll also need a sworn statement about how and where you found Lily. If you can bring me those things by the end of the week, I can have the petition ready to file by Monday." "We can do that," Caleb said. "One more thing," Harding said, his expression serious. "What about schooling? Lily's at an age where education matters." "There's a schoolhouse in Redemption Creek," Margaret said immediately. "I know Miss Cassidy, the teacher. Good woman, runs a solid school. We can arrange for Lily to attend starting this fall term." "Well, that'll look good to Judge Morrison," Harding said approvingly. "He's a strong believer in education for all children, girls included. The fact that you're planning for her schooling will weigh heavily in your favor." They spent another hour going over details, answering Harding's questions, discussing the legal process. By the time they emerged back onto the street, the sun was high and Lily's head was spinning with information about petitions and hearings and legal guardianship. "You did well in there," Caleb said quietly, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Answered clearly, spoke up when you needed to." Harding was impressed. "I was scared," Lily admitted. "Being scared and doing it anyway. That's called courage," Margaret said. She looked up and down the street, then smiled. "Come on, we've got business in town anyway, and Lily needs clothes. Let's visit the general store." The general store was a treasure trove of goods, bolts of fabric, ready-made clothing, tools, foodstuffs, everything a frontier family might need. The proprietor, a round woman named Mrs. Chen, greeted Margaret warmly and eyed Lily with open curiosity. "This is Lily," Margaret said simply. "She'll be living at Red Willow. She needs clothes, practical things, well made. 2 everyday dresses, 1 for Sunday, undergarments, nightgowns, a warm coat for winter, and boots that actually fit." Mrs. Chen's curiosity clearly burned, but she was too professional to pry. "Of course, come with me, child. Let's get your measurements." An hour later, Lily stood in new clothes, a sturdy brown dress that fit properly, new boots that didn't flop when she walked, a coat that would keep her warm when the weather turned. More clothes were being wrapped for them to take home. Dresses in practical calico, soft flannel nightgowns, stockings and undergarments, even hair ribbons in blue that matched her eyes. "You look like a proper young lady," Caleb said when Lily emerged from the changing area, and there was approval in his eyes that made her stand a little straighter. Margaret paid for everything without flinching at the total, then added a new doll to the pile. Not fancy, but well-made and sturdy, with both button eyes intact and no stuffing leaking out. "Every girl should have a doll that's not falling apart," she said when Lily started to protest. They loaded their purchases into the wagon and stopped at a restaurant for lunch. Real restaurant food, served on china plates with silverware that matched. Lily sat between her soon-to-be guardians and ate beef stew that was almost as good as Margaret's, listening to them discuss ranch business and fall plans with the easy comfort of people who'd worked together for years. On the ride home, with the afternoon sun warm and the wagon loaded with proof of her new life, Lily finally let herself believe it might actually be real. These people had spent money on her, filed legal papers for her, made plans that included her. They'd done it not grudgingly, but matter-of-factly, as if taking in an abandoned child was just the natural thing to do when you had the means and the opportunity. "Thank you," she said quietly as Red Willow came into view. "For everything. For stopping yesterday. For bringing me here. For wanting me." Margaret's arm came around her shoulders, warm and steady. "You don't need to thank us for doing what's right, honey, but you're welcome anyway." That evening, after a dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables from Margaret's kitchen garden, after Lily had washed and changed into one of her new nightgowns, after she'd been tucked into the bed that was starting to feel like hers, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. 2 days ago, she'd been unwanted cargo in a wagon heading toward a life that had no room for her. Yesterday morning, she'd stood alone on an empty trail with nothing but a ragged doll and fading hope. Now she was here, in a real bed, in a real home, with real people who'd chosen her deliberately and were taking legal steps to make that choice permanent. It was almost too much to take in. But lying there in the darkness, Lily let herself feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something tentative and fragile but growing stronger with each passing hour. She let herself feel safe. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike to Lily, rising with the sun, helping Margaret with breakfast, spending mornings learning the ranch routines, afternoons exploring her new world with careful wonder. The hearing date approached like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and anxiety-inducing, but Caleb and Margaret moved through the days with such steady confidence that some of it rubbed off on her. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, the first real hint of autumn in the air. Lily dressed with trembling hands in the Sunday dress Margaret had bought her, dark green with a white collar, modest and proper. Margaret helped her with her hair, braiding it neatly and tying it with ribbons, her touch gentle but sure. "You nervous?" Margaret asked, meeting Lily's eyes in the small mirror above the washstand. "Yes, ma'am." "That's natural, but remember what Mr. Harding told us. This is mostly a formality. Judge Morrison just wants to see that you're well cared for and that you want to be here. You just tell the truth, answer his questions honestly, and it'll be fine." Lily nodded, trying to believe it. The past 3 weeks had been good, better than good, but she'd learned not to trust good things to last. People changed their minds, circumstances shifted, adults made promises they couldn't keep. Downstairs, Caleb was already dressed in his best suit, a dark wool affair that made him look more like a banker than a rancher. He looked uncomfortable in the stiff collar, but determined, and when he saw Lily, he smiled reassuringly. "Ready as we'll ever be," he said. "Let's get this done." The ride to Redemption Creek felt longer than usual, the silence in the wagon heavy with anticipation. Lily sat between her guardians-to-be, her hands clasped tight in her lap, watching familiar landmarks pass. She'd made this journey twice now in 3 weeks, once for the initial meeting with Harding, once when Margaret had enrolled her in school. Each time the town had felt a little less foreign, a little more like somewhere she might actually belong. The courthouse was an imposing brick building at the end of Main Street, 2 stories tall with white columns that were meant to suggest dignity and justice. Samuel Harding met them on the steps, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes kind when they landed on Lily. "Right on time," he said. "Judge Morrison is hearing cases this morning. We're third on the docket, so we'll have a bit of a wait. I want to go over a few things before we go in." They gathered in a side room, a small, spare space with hard wooden benches and a window that looked out onto the street. Harding reviewed what would happen, what questions the judge might ask, how Lily should respond. His voice was calm and methodical, stripping the mystery and therefore some of the fear from the process. "The key thing to remember," he said, looking directly at Lily, "is that Judge Morrison cares about what's best for you. He's seen plenty of custody cases, and he's good at reading people. He'll want to know that you understand what's happening and that you genuinely want to be with Caleb and Margaret. Can you tell him that?" "Yes, sir," Lily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good. And if he asks about your stepfamily, just tell the truth about what happened. Don't embellish, don't get emotional if you can help it. Just facts. Understand?" Lily nodded. The truth was bad enough without embellishment. They waited. Other cases were called, a property dispute, something involving unpaid debts, and Lily listened to the muffled voices through the courtroom doors, trying to gauge the judge's temperament from tone alone. Caleb sat beside her, solid and quiet, while Margaret paced near the window, too restless to sit still. Finally, a bailiff opened the doors and called, "In the matter of guardianship for Lily Rowan, Holt petition." Harding stood. "That's us. Remember what we discussed. Stay calm, tell the truth, and trust the process." The courtroom was smaller than Lily had expected, with wooden pews for observers, a raised bench where the judge sat, and a witness stand to one side. Judge Morrison was a lean man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything at once. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Harding," he said, his voice carrying easy authority, "I've read your petition. Let's proceed." Harding presented their case with professional efficiency, recounting how Caleb had found Lily abandoned, describing the circumstances that had led to her situation, outlining Caleb and Margaret's qualifications as guardians. He submitted financial documents proving their ability to provide for a child, letters of reference from townspeople attesting to their character, and the enrollment papers showing Lily had already been registered for school. Judge Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his face betraying nothing. When Harding finished, the judge looked at Caleb. "Mr. Holt, stand, please." Caleb stood, his posture straight but not stiff. "Yes, Your Honor." "You run Red Willow Ranch, correct? Tell me about your operation." Caleb described the ranch in clear, factual terms: acreage, livestock, income, employees. He explained his partnership with Margaret, the division of labor and profits, the stability of their business. His voice was steady, confident without being arrogant, and Judge Morrison nodded occasionally as he spoke. "And you're not married to Miss Holt?" the judge asked, his tone neutral but pointed. "No, Your Honor. We're business partners and close friends. Our arrangement is unconventional but entirely proper. We maintain separate quarters in the house, and our relationship is based on mutual respect and shared business interests, nothing more." "I see. And you believe this arrangement provides a suitable environment for raising a child?" "I do, Your Honor. Lily would have 2 adults looking after her welfare, each of us bringing different strengths to her care. She'd grow up seeing a woman who runs a successful business, who's respected for her abilities and judgment. She'd learn about hard work, responsibility, and the value of partnerships based on equality. I believe those are valuable lessons." Judge Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been approval. "Miss Holt, please stand." Margaret rose, her chin lifted slightly, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "Your Honor, you've been working cattle for how long?" Nearly 15 years, Your Honor. Started when I was 17 on a ranch in Kansas. I know cattle, I know horses, and I know how to run an operation efficiently. And you believe you can balance ranch management with caring for a child? Margaret's voice was firm. Yes, Your Honor, I grew up doing both. My mother ran our family farm while raising 5 children. It's hard work, but it's not impossible, especially with a partner who shares the load. Lily wouldn't be raised by hired help while I ignored her. She'd be part of our daily life, learning alongside us, cared for properly. Why do you want this responsibility, Miss Holt? You've built a successful life without children. Why take on a child now, and specifically this child? Margaret was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with visible care. Because I was an unwanted child once, Your Honor. I know what it does to you, that feeling of being a burden, of taking up space you're not entitled to. I survived, but I don't want Lily to just survive. I want her to thrive. And because Caleb and I have built something good at Red Willow, something worth sharing with a child who needs what we can offer. The judge's expression softened slightly. Sit down, Miss Holt. He turned his attention to Lily, and his voice gentled. Young lady, come up here to the witness stand, please. Lily's legs felt shaky as she crossed the courtroom and climbed into the wooden chair. It was too big for her, making her feel even smaller than she was. Judge Morrison looked at her for a long moment, his eyes kind despite their sharpness. Do you know why you're here today, Lily? Yes, sir. Mr. Holt and Miss Holt want to be my legal guardians. And do you understand what that means? It means they'd be responsible for me until I'm grown. They'd make decisions about my education and health and where I live. That's right. Now, I need you to tell me in your own words what happened before Mr. Holt found you. Can you do that? Lily took a breath and told the story. Her mother's death, living with her stepfamily, realizing she wasn't wanted, the morning she was left on the trail. Her voice stayed steady through most of it, though it wavered when she described watching the wagon disappear. Judge Morrison listened intently, his expression growing grimmer as the story unfolded. Did your stepfamily hurt you physically? He asked when she finished. No, sir, they just didn't want me anymore. And when Mr. Holt found you, what did you think? I was scared at first, but he gave me water and food, and he gave me a choice about what to do next. Nobody had given me a choice in a long time. And now? How do you feel about living at Red Willow Ranch? Lily looked across the courtroom at Caleb and Margaret, sitting side by side, watching her with expressions of encouragement and concern. She thought about the past 3 weeks, Margaret teaching her to make biscuits, Caleb showing her how to curry a horse properly, both of them sitting with her in the evenings while she practiced reading aloud from books they'd bought for her. She thought about the room that was becoming hers, the clothes that fit, the meals that appeared regularly, the way they listened when she spoke as if her words mattered. It feels like home, she said quietly. More than anywhere has felt in a long time. They're kind to me, but not because they pity me. They treat me like I belong there. Do you want to stay with them? Yes, sir. Very much. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. And if your stepfamily came back and wanted to take you with them, what would you say? The question sent a chill through her, but Lily met the judge's eyes steadily. I'd say no, sir. They left me to die on that trail. They made their choice, and I'm making mine. I choose Mr. Holt and Miss Holt. Something shifted in Judge Morrison's expression, a flicker of respect, perhaps, for a child brave enough to claim her own future. You can step down, Lily. She returned to her seat between Caleb and Margaret's hand found hers under the edge of the bench, squeezing gently. Judge Morrison reviewed his notes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. I've heard enough, he said finally. Mr. Harding, your petition is well documented and thorough. Mr. Holt, Miss Holt, your financial situation is stable and your references are excellent. Most importantly, this child has made her wishes clear with a maturity beyond her years. He looked directly at Lily. Young lady, the law exists to protect children, especially children who've been failed by the adults who should have protected them. Your stepfamily violated that sacred trust, and while they should face consequences for their actions, you're right that your future matters more than their punishment. He turned his attention back to Caleb and Margaret. I'm granting this petition. As of today, Caleb Holt and Margaret Holt are the legal guardians of Lily Rowan, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. This guardianship will remain in effect until Lily reaches the age of majority or until circumstances warrant a review, whichever comes first. Relief flooded through Lily so intensely it made her dizzy. Beside her, she felt Caleb's shoulders relax and heard Margaret's quiet exhale. Judge Morrison wasn't finished. I'm also issuing an order that if Lily's former guardians are located, they are to have no contact with her without explicit permission from her legal guardians in this court. Mr. Harding, draft that order and I'll sign it this afternoon. Yes, Your Honor, Harding said, satisfaction evident in his voice. One more thing. The judge's voice sharpened slightly. Mr. Holt, Miss Holt, you've taken on a significant responsibility. This child has been through trauma that will take time to heal. She'll need patience, consistency, and unconditional support. Can you provide that? Yes, Your Honor, they said in unison. Then I wish you well. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a decisive crack, and suddenly it was done. Lily was legally theirs, and they were legally hers. The relief was so overwhelming that Lily felt tears prick her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. Harding turned to them with a rare smile. Congratulations. The paperwork will be ready in a few days, official copies of the guardianship order. I'll have them sent to the ranch. Thank you, Samuel, Caleb said, shaking his hand firmly. For everything. They emerged from the courthouse into bright autumn sunlight that felt celebratory, as if the world itself was acknowledging this new beginning. Margaret crouched down in front of Lily, taking both her hands. How do you feel? She asked gently. Safe, Lily said, and the word encompassed everything. The fear that had finally released its grip, the future that suddenly felt possible, the belonging she'd barely dared to hope for. Good, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. That's exactly how you should feel. They stopped at the same restaurant where they'd eaten weeks ago, ordered a celebratory lunch and lingered over pie and coffee while the tension of the morning dissolved into quiet joy. Other diners glanced at them curiously. Word traveled fast in a town like Redemption Creek, but nobody interrupted their small celebration. On the ride home, with the afternoon sun warm on their faces and the prairie grass turning gold in the slanting light, Caleb broke the comfortable silence. There's something Margaret and I have been discussing, he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. Something we wanted to wait to mention until after the hearing. Lily's stomach tightened with automatic anxiety. What is it? Margaret turned to look at her, and her expression was thoughtful. The arrangement Caleb and I have, our partnership, it works well for us, but it's unconventional, and that can create complications, especially now, with you to think about. People talk, Caleb added. They always have, but we never much cared because it was just us. But you'll be starting school, making friends, building a life in this community. We don't want our unconventional situation to make things harder for you. I don't understand, Lily said quietly. Are you saying I can't stay? No, Margaret said quickly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Lord, no, you're not going anywhere. What we're saying is that Caleb and I are considering making our arrangement more conventional, getting married. The words hung in the air, unexpected and momentous. Lily looked between them, trying to understand. But you said we're not in love, no, Caleb said frankly. But we care about each other deeply. We respect each other, and we've built a good life together. Marriage would just formalize what's already true, that we're partners in every way that matters. It would also eliminate any questions about propriety, Margaret added. It would make us a conventional family in the eyes of the community, which matters more now that you're part of this equation. We don't want you facing gossip or judgment because of how Caleb and I have chosen to live. But we're not making this decision just because of you, Caleb emphasized. We've been considering it for a while. You being here just made the conversation more urgent, more obviously the right thing to do. Lily processed this carefully. Would things change between all of us? Not in any way that matters, Margaret said firmly. Caleb and I would still be equal partners in the ranch. We'd still have separate quarters, though we'd probably have to make some adjustments for appearance's sake. But in terms of how we operate day to day, how we care for you, nothing fundamental would change. We just have a piece of paper that makes everything official. When would you do it? Lily asked. Caleb and Margaret exchanged a glance, and something unspoken passed between them. The kind of communication that comes from years of working closely together. Soon, Margaret said. Maybe next week. Something simple, just the three of us and a preacher. No fuss, no big ceremony, just making it legal. Would I be there? The question came out smaller than Lily intended. Of course you'd be there, Caleb said, and his voice was warm with certainty. You're part of this family now. That means you're part of all the important moments. The wagon rolled on toward Red Willow, and Lily sat between her guardians, soon to be her married guardians, and tried to wrap her mind around how completely her life had changed in 3 weeks. From abandoned child to legally protected daughter, from unwanted burden to integral family member, from uncertain future to genuine home. That evening, after dinner, after Lily had changed into her nightgown and was getting ready for bed, Margaret knocked softly on her door. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret entered carrying something wrapped in tissue paper. She sat on the edge of Lily's bed and held out the package. "I wanted to give you this. It's not much, but it felt important." Lily unwrapped the tissue carefully to reveal a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The three of them, taken that afternoon by a photographer in Redemption Creek whom Caleb had insisted they visit. They stood together on the courthouse steps, Lily between Caleb and Margaret, all of them looking at the camera with expressions that ranged from solemn to quietly joyful. It was the first photograph Lily had ever been in since her mother died. "Families should have photographs," Margaret said softly. "Proof that they existed, that they mattered. This is proof that we're a family now, chosen, not obligated. Official, not temporary." Lily's fingers traced the frame, the image of 3 people who'd found each other under unlikely circumstances and decided to make something permanent out of chance. "Thank you," she whispered. Margaret hesitated, then leaned forward and kissed Lily's forehead, a gesture that was becoming more natural with each passing day. "Sleep well, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a school day, and Miss Cassidy doesn't tolerate tardiness." After Margaret left, Lily set the photograph on the chest of drawers where she could see it from her bed. Then she climbed under the quilt and lay in the darkness, thinking about courtrooms and judges and 2 adults who'd stood before the law and claimed her as their own. She thought about the question Judge Morrison had asked, whether she'd choose Caleb and Margaret over her stepfamily if they came back. The answer had been easy then, spoken in the formal context of a courtroom. But lying here now, she tested it again in the privacy of her own heart. Yes. 1,000 times yes. These people, this quiet rancher with his steady gray eyes, this fierce woman who'd survived her own childhood wounds, they'd seen her standing alone on a dusty trail and decided she was worth stopping for. They'd given her choices when she'd had none, defended her right to safety and stability, filed legal papers to make sure nobody could take her away. They'd made her part of something bigger than herself, a family built on respect and shared purpose, unconventional but real. And now they were changing their own lives to make her place in it more secure, more permanent, more protected from judgment and gossip. Lily had been abandoned by people who should have loved her, but she'd been found by people who chose to, and that choice, she was beginning to understand, meant more than blood ever could. Outside her window, the prairie stretched away under a sky thick with stars, vast and indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere out there, a wagon continued west toward Oregon, carrying people who'd left a child behind without looking back. But here, in this room, in this house, on this ranch, that child was safe and wanted and home. And tomorrow, life would continue, school and chores and the ordinary routines that made up a family's days. But underneath it all would be this new certainty, this legal protection, this profound gift of being chosen. Lily closed her eyes and let sleep take her, secure in the knowledge that she belonged here now, not by accident or obligation, but by law and by choice. And that made all the difference. The wedding took place 6 days later on a Wednesday afternoon when the autumn light fell golden through the windows of the small church in Redemption Creek. Margaret had insisted on Wednesday specifically because it was a workday, which meant fewer townspeople would be available to gawk or gossip. This wasn't a spectacle, she'd said firmly. This was simply making their family arrangement legal and proper. Lily wore her best dress, the green one from the hearing, and Margaret had woven wildflowers into her braided hair that morning. Margaret herself wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, elegant but practical, her hair pinned up in a style more formal than her usual working arrangement, but not elaborate. Caleb had put on his suit again, the same one from the courthouse, and though he tugged at the collar occasionally, he wore it with quiet dignity. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony in his matter-of-fact way, a man who'd married enough frontier couples to recognize that not all marriages followed the same pattern. He asked the required questions, received the expected answers, and pronounced them husband and wife with no more fanfare than necessary. When Caleb kissed Margaret's cheek, chaste and respectful, Lily saw the slight relaxation in both their shoulders, the relief of having made official what had been true in practice for years. "Well," Margaret said as they emerged onto the church steps, "that's done." "That's done," Caleb agreed and took her hand, his new wife's hand, with a squeeze that spoke of partnership and commitment, even if it didn't speak of passion. They stopped at the general store on the way out of town so Margaret could buy fabric for new curtains, and Mrs. Chen's eyes went immediately to the simple gold band on Margaret's finger. "Well now," the proprietor said with evident satisfaction, "congratulations are in order, I see." "Thank you," Margaret said evenly. "We figured it was time to make things proper, especially with Lily to consider." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly and looked at Lily with new warmth, as if the marriage had somehow legitimized the child's place in a way the guardianship hadn't quite managed. "You've got good people raising you now, child. That's a blessing." "Yes, ma'am," Lily said quietly, and meant it with her whole heart. The ride home felt different somehow, more settled, more complete. The three of them sat in the wagon as they always did, Lily between her guardians, but now those guardians were legally bound to each other as well as to her. They were a family in every official sense, parents and child, husband and wife, a unit recognized by law and church and community. "How does it feel?" Lily asked as Red Willow came into view, the building solid and welcoming in the afternoon light. "About the same as yesterday," Caleb said honestly, "but also more secure. Does that make sense?" "I think so. Like having a fence around something that was already yours." Margaret smiled. "That's exactly what it's like. Smart girl." That night at dinner, Margaret had made roast chicken and potatoes, nothing fancy but cooked with care. They sat around the kitchen table as they had every night for weeks. But there was a quality of permanence now that hadn't existed before. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't conditional. This was real and legal and protected. "I've been thinking," Caleb said as he served himself more potatoes, "about what comes next. For all of us, but especially for Lily." Lily looked up from her plate, anxiety flickering automatically despite the safety she'd grown to trust. "What do you mean?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly, reading her expression. "Just practical planning. You're 8 years old, almost 9 now. You're in school, which is good and important. But there's also ranch life to learn, skills that'll serve you well, whether you stay here or eventually go somewhere else." "I want to stay here," Lily said immediately. "We want that too," Margaret assured her. "But that doesn't mean you won't have choices later. College maybe, or travel, or your own ventures. What Caleb's saying is that we want to equip you for whatever future you choose. That means education, both book learning and practical skills." Caleb nodded. "Margaret can teach you about cattle, horses, ranch management, all the things she knows. I can teach you about finances, dealing with banks and buyers, the business side of running an operation like this. Between us, you'll learn what it takes to stand on your own 2 feet." "But that's years away," Margaret added, seeing the overwhelmed look on Lily's face. "Right now, you focus on school and settling in. The other things will come gradually, as you're ready for them." Lily absorbed this, the notion that these people were already thinking about her distant future, planning for her to have options and independence. It was such a stark contrast to her stepfamily, who'd seen her only as a burden to be shed at the first opportunity. "Can I learn to ride?" she asked tentatively. "Really ride, not just sitting in front of someone else?" Caleb's eyes lit up. "Absolutely. In fact, I've been thinking about that. There's a mare in the stable, Daisy, who's gentle and well-trained, perfect for a beginner. We can start lessons this weekend if the weather holds." The promise of learning to ride carried Lily through the rest of the week with barely contained excitement. School occupied her mornings and early afternoons, Miss Cassidy was a good teacher, stern but fair, and the other children had mostly accepted Lily's sudden appearance among them with the easy adaptability of youth. A few had asked questions about where she'd come from, why she was living with the Holts, but Lily had learned to give simple answers that didn't invite deeper prying. "My mother died and they took me in," covered the essential truth without requiring her to relive the abandonment. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for a first riding lesson. Caleb led Lily to the stable after breakfast, where Daisy waited, a bay mare with a gentle eye and patient temperament. She was smaller than Caleb's gelding, more proportionate for a child learning to ride. "First rule," Caleb said as he showed Lily how to approach the horse, "is respect. Horses are big and strong, and they can hurt you if you're careless or cruel. But if you treat them with respect and patience, they'll be your most loyal partners." He demonstrated how to curry the mare, how to check her hooves, how to saddle her properly with each strap and buckle serving a purpose. Lily watched intently, committing every movement to memory. When Daisy was ready, Caleb led them to the corral and helped Lily mount. The view from horseback was entirely different from sitting in front of someone else in a saddle. Up here, Lily felt taller, more capable, and the mare's warmth and power beneath her was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. "Good," Caleb said, adjusting her feet in the stirrups. "Now, the key is balance and communication. The horse can feel everything you do, how you sit, how you hold the reins, even how you breathe. You're not forcing her to obey. You're asking her to work with you." They spent an hour on basics, how to sit properly, how to hold the reins, how to use legs and body weight to communicate direction and speed. Daisy was patient with Lily's awkward attempts, responding to even the clumsiest cues with gentle cooperation. By the end of the lesson, Lily was walking the mare around the corral with something approaching confidence. "You're a natural," Caleb said as he helped her dismount. "We'll do this every Saturday, and during the week when there's time. By spring, you'll be riding out with us to check the herds." The thought filled Lily with pride so intense it was almost painful. Riding out with them, being useful, contributing, earning her place not through gratitude but through competence. As autumn deepened into winter, a routine established itself that felt increasingly solid and real. Lily rose early, helped Margaret with breakfast, walked to school when weather permitted, or rode in the wagon with Caleb when it didn't. Afternoons were split between homework, chores, and riding lessons that gradually expanded her skills. Evenings were spent around the kitchen table, sometimes with work, sometimes with reading aloud, sometimes with conversation that ranged from mundane ranch business to bigger questions about life and choices and what it meant to build something worth keeping. Margaret taught her to bake bread, to preserve vegetables for winter, to mend clothes with neat, invisible stitches. Caleb taught her to read account ledgers, to recognize different cattle brands, to understand market prices and supply chains. Both of them taught her, through example more than instruction, about integrity and hard work and treating people fairly, regardless of their station. The nightmares came occasionally, dreams of being left behind, of watching wagons disappear, of finding herself alone again. But when Lily woke gasping in the darkness, Margaret was always there within minutes, alerted by some maternal instinct that transcended biology. She'd sit on the edge of Lily's bed, solid and real, and talk in her low, steady voice until the fear receded and sleep became possible again. "It's normal," Margaret said one night after a particularly bad dream. "Trauma doesn't just disappear because your circumstances improve. It takes time to really believe you're safe, to trust that good things can last." "How long did it take you?" Lily asked, remembering what Margaret had said about her own difficult childhood. "Years," Margaret admitted. "I was older than you when things got better for me, and I'd learned to trust nothing and no one. But eventually, with enough time and enough proof that the good things weren't going away, I started to believe it. You will too." "What if they come back?" Lily voiced her deepest fear, the one that lurked beneath even the worst nightmares. "My stepfamily. What if they change their minds?" Margaret's expression went hard. "They won't. But if they do, they'll have to go through me and Caleb and every legal protection we've put in place. And honey, I promise you, they won't get past that. You're ours now, legally and in every other way that matters. Nobody's taking you anywhere." The first snow came in early December, transforming the prairie into a landscape of white silence. School closed for the winter, too dangerous for children to travel in blizzard conditions. And Lily found herself spending long days at the ranch, learning winter routines, how to break ice on water troughs, how to ensure cattle had access to hay when grass disappeared beneath snow, how to maintain equipment and prepare for spring while waiting out the cold months. She turned 9 in January with a small celebration that felt enormous to her. A cake Margaret baked, presents wrapped in brown paper and twine, Caleb presenting her with a pocket knife and teaching her how to use it safely. It was the first birthday she'd celebrated since her mother died, and the fact that these people had remembered, had planned, had cared enough to mark the occasion, moved her more than she could articulate. "Make a wish," Margaret said as Lily stared at the 9 candles flickering on the cake. Lily closed her eyes and wished for what she had right now to last forever. This home, these people, this security that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. Then she blew out the candles in one breath, and Caleb and Margaret applauded as if she'd accomplished something remarkable. Winter eased into spring, snow melting into mud that eventually dried into firm ground. School reopened, and Lily returned with renewed confidence, her reading and arithmetic having improved during the winter months under Margaret and Caleb's evening instruction. The other children no longer treated her as a newcomer. She was simply part of the landscape now, the Holt's daughter, accepted without question. It was late March when the stranger appeared at Red Willow Ranch, arriving on a tired horse just as the sun was setting, and Lily was helping Margaret prepare dinner. Caleb was still out checking the south pasture, and Margaret went to the door when the knock came, wiping her hands on her apron. The man on the porch was middle-aged and weathered, with the look of someone who'd traveled a long distance. "Evening, ma'am. I'm looking for a child. A girl. About 9 now. Name of Lily Rowan. I was told she might be here." Margaret's entire body went still, her expression shifting from welcoming to coldly protective in an instant. "Who's asking?" "Name's Walter Crane. I'm her mother's brother, her uncle. I only recently learned what happened to my sister, about her passing and the child being taken in by her husband's new family. Been trying to track Lily down since." Behind Margaret, Lily had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen table. An uncle. She vaguely remembered her mother mentioning a brother, but she'd never met him. And she had no idea if his claim was legitimate or just another complication in a life that had finally achieved stability. "Wait here," Margaret said, her tone brooking no argument. She closed the door firmly and turned to Lily. "Do you know this man? Mama talked about a brother sometimes, but I never met him. I don't know if it's really him or if he's lying." Margaret's jaw was tight. "Either way, he's not taking you anywhere tonight. Let me handle this." She went back to the door, opening it just enough to speak through. "Mr. Crane, if you're truly Lily's uncle, then we'll need to verify that claim properly and legally. The child has been through enough upheaval. I'm not handing her over to someone who shows up out of nowhere with nothing but his word to back up his identity. I understand your caution, ma'am, and I respect it, but I've got papers, letters from my sister, a family Bible with birth records. I can prove who I am." "Then you can prove it to a judge," Margaret said firmly. "Lily Rowan is under legal guardianship, mine and my husband's. That guardianship was granted by Judge Morrison in Redemption Creek, and it stands unless a court says otherwise. If you want to contest it, you'll need to file the proper papers and make your case in front of a judge." Crane's expression flickered with frustration, but also something that might have been reluctant respect. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, ma'am. I just want to see my sister's child. Make sure she's all right." "She's more than all right. She's healthy, well-fed, educated, and legally protected. Now I suggest you get a room in Redemption Creek. Talk to Judge Morrison or the lawyer Samuel Harding and approach this the right way. But you're not seeing Lily tonight, and you're not taking her anywhere." She closed the door with finality and locked it, then turned to find Lily standing frozen in the kitchen, her face stricken with fear that the good life she'd built was about to be ripped away. "Is he going to take me?" Lily whispered. "Not without a fight," Margaret said grimly. She moved to the window, watching as Crane mounted his horse and rode away toward town, then closed the curtains decisively. "Where the hell is Caleb? We need to talk to Samuel Harding first thing tomorrow." Caleb arrived 30 minutes later to find both Margaret and Lily tense with anxiety. Margaret explained the situation in clipped, efficient sentences, while Lily sat silent at the table, her world once again feeling precarious and uncertain. "Uncle," Caleb said thoughtfully when Margaret finished. "Blood relation. That complicates things." "I don't care if he's her blood," Margaret said fiercely. "He wasn't there when she needed family. He didn't show up when her mother died or when her stepfamily took her in. He certainly wasn't there when she was abandoned on that trail. Now that she's safe and settled, now he appears? I don't trust it." "Neither do I," Caleb agreed. "But we need to handle this carefully. If he is her uncle and can prove it, he might have legal standing to contest our guardianship. We need Harding's advice." That night, Lily lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, staring at the ceiling and feeling the cold finger of fear tracing down her spine. She'd allowed herself to believe she was safe, that the worst was behind her. She'd started to trust that good things could last, that families chose to stay together. Now this stranger appeared claiming blood ties, and suddenly everything felt fragile again. What if the judge decided blood mattered more than choice? What if Walter Crane could prove he was her uncle and the court gave him custody? What if she was ripped away from Red Willow, from Caleb and Margaret, from the first place that had felt like home in years? The next morning dawned cold and overcast, matching Lily's mood perfectly. Caleb drove them to Redemption Creek in grim silence, all three of them understanding that the hearing ahead could change everything. Samuel Harding met them in his office, his expression serious as he listened to their account of Crane's appearance. "Blood relatives do have legal standing," he said carefully. "If he can prove he's her uncle and that he's capable of providing appropriate care, a judge might consider his claim. But," he held up a hand as Margaret started to protest, "that doesn't mean it's automatic. Several factors weigh in Lily's favor." "Such as?" Caleb asked. "First, your guardianship is already established and has been functioning successfully for 6 months. Courts don't like disrupting stable situations without good cause. Second, where was this uncle when Lily was abandoned? His absence during her time of greatest need doesn't speak well for his claim of familial devotion. Third, and most importantly, Lily is old enough that her preferences carry significant weight. Judge Morrison listened to her before. He'll listen to her again." "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. "We wait for Crane to file his petition, if he does. Then we respond with evidence of Lily's well-being in your care, documentation of his absence during critical periods, and Lily's own testimony about where she wants to live. We make it clear that removing her from a stable, loving home would be traumatic and not in her best interests." Harding looked at Lily directly. "How do you feel about this man's claim? If he is your uncle, does that make you want to go with him?" Lily's voice was small but certain. "No, sir. I don't know him. He might be blood, but Caleb and Margaret are my family. They're the ones who were there when I needed someone. They're the ones who chose me." "That's a powerful statement," Harding said with approval. "If it comes to a hearing, that's exactly what you'll need to say." Walter Crane filed his petition 3 days later, and the hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Those 2 weeks were among the longest of Lily's life, each day shadowed by uncertainty, each night haunted by dreams of being taken away. Caleb and Margaret tried to maintain normalcy, continuing with routines and lessons in daily life, but tension permeated everything. The day of the hearing arrived with spring rain falling steadily, turning the roads to mud and matching the somber mood in the wagon. They arrived at the courthouse to find Walter Crane already there with his own lawyer, a thin man named Patterson, who had the sharp look of someone who fought hard for his clients. Judge Morrison called the court to order and looked at the assembly with weary patience. "We're here to address a petition from Walter Crane seeking guardianship of Lily Rowan, currently under the legal guardianship of Caleb and Margaret Holt. Mr. Patterson, present your case." Patterson stood and began methodically building Crane's argument. He presented papers proving Crane was indeed Lily's uncle, her mother's brother. He showed letters indicating Crane had been working in California when his sister died and had only recently learned of her death and Lily's subsequent abandonment. He argued that blood family had priority and that Crane, as Lily's closest living relative, had both the right and the responsibility to raise his sister's child. Crane himself testified, speaking earnestly about his love for his late sister, his regret at being absent during her final years, his desire to honor her memory by caring for her daughter. He seemed sincere, and Lily felt a flicker of guilt for not wanting to go with him. Then it was Harding's turn. He presented the documentation of Lily's guardianship, the evidence of her thriving under Caleb and Margaret's care, school records showing academic progress, letters from Miss Cassidy praising Lily's development, testimony about the stable home environment. He emphasized the length of Crane's absence, the fact that he'd made no effort to locate Lily when she was abandoned, only appearing after she was already safely settled. The question before this court, Harding said firmly, is not whether Mr. Crane is a blood relative. Clearly, he is. The question is whether disrupting a stable, nurturing guardianship to satisfy a claim of blood relationship serves the child's best interests. I submit that it does not. Lily Rowan has found safety, stability, and genuine family with the Holts. To remove her from that environment would be traumatic and harmful, regardless of Mr. Crane's good intentions. Judge Morrison listened to both sides, asked pointed questions, reviewed documents. Then he looked at Lily. "Young lady, I remember you from our previous hearing. You spoke clearly and maturely then about your situation and your choices. I'd like to hear from you again now. Please approach the stand." Lily walked to the witness chair on shaking legs, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the courtroom must hear it. Judge Morrison's expression was kind, but serious. "Lily, you've heard Mr. Crane's testimony. He says he's your uncle, your mother's brother. Do you have any memory of him?" "No, Your Honor. Mama mentioned having a brother sometimes, but I never met him. I don't know him at all." "And if I were to place you in his custody, how would you feel about that?" Lily took a deep breath, gathering every bit of courage she possessed. "Scared, Your Honor, and angry. Not at him exactly, but at the situation. I finally found a home where I belong, where people want me not because of blood, but because they chose me. Caleb and Margaret were there when I had nothing and nobody. They gave me choices, protected me legally, taught me that I matter. Mr. Crane might be my uncle by blood, but he wasn't there when I needed family most. Blood didn't protect me when I was left on that trail. Choice did. Caleb's choice to stop, Margaret's choice to welcome me. Their choice to make me their daughter legally. That's what family means to me now. Not blood that shows up when it's convenient, but people who stay even when it's hard." The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Walter Crane. "Mr. Crane, I don't doubt your sincerity or your connection to this child through her mother. But this young lady has articulated something profound, that family is defined by commitment and presence, not merely by shared blood. Where were you when she was abandoned, when she was alone and terrified? You have explanations, and they may even be good ones, but the fact remains that you were absent during her greatest need. The Holts were present. They acted when action mattered. They've provided 6 months of stable, loving care that has clearly benefited this child enormously." He paused, then delivered his ruling. "I'm denying your petition, Mr. Crane. The existing guardianship will stand. This child has found her family, and I will not disrupt that for a blood claim that comes too late. Case dismissed." Relief crashed over Lily so powerfully that she swayed in her seat. Margaret was there instantly, steadying her, while Caleb stood behind them both like a wall against any further threat. Walter Crane looked stunned, then resigned, and finally nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth he'd known all along. As they left the courthouse, Crane approached them hesitantly. "Miss Lily," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. Your mother, my sister, she was a good woman, and I should have kept better track of her life and yours. I'm glad you found people who were there. Maybe—" He looked at Caleb and Margaret. "Maybe someday, if it's all right with your guardians and with you, I could visit? Just to know you, to tell you about your mother when she was young?" Lily looked up at Margaret and Caleb, silently asking their permission. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Maybe someday," she said, "when some time has passed and everyone's had a chance to settle. Write to us at Red Willow Ranch. We'll consider it." Crane nodded, accepting the small olive branch, and walked away. And Lily, standing between the two people who'd proven through action and commitment that they were her real family, felt something fundamental shift inside her. The fear that had shadowed her for months finally, truly released its grip. She was safe. She was chosen. She was home. and no claim of blood or convenience or legality could change that truth now. The judge had confirmed what Lily had known in her heart for months. Family wasn't about who you shared blood with. It was about who showed up, who stayed, who chose you, and kept choosing you every single day. And Caleb and Margaret Holt had chosen her completely. The years that followed the courthouse decision unfolded, with the steady rhythm of seasons turning, spring planting and calving, summer heat and long days working cattle, autumn harvest and preparation, winter's quiet introspection and planning. Lily grew from a frightened 9-year-old into a confident young woman, shaped by the ranch and the people who'd claimed her as their own. By the time she turned 12, she could ride as well as any of the ranch hands, could rope a calf with accuracy born of patient practice, could read account ledgers and understand profit margins. She'd shot up in height, all gangly limbs and growing confidence, her dark hair usually braided for practicality, and her hands developing the calluses that came from real work. Margaret taught her everything she knew about managing cattle, about reading weather patterns and grass quality, about the 1,000 small decisions that made the difference between a ranch that merely survived and one that thrived. They spent long days together writing fence lines, checking water sources, evaluating herd health. And in those hours, Margaret shared stories of her own difficult childhood with more detail than she'd ever offered before. "I was 14 when I ran away from the last family that took me in," Margaret said one afternoon as they sat on their horses overlooking the south pasture. "They weren't cruel exactly, just indifferent. I was labor, not family. So I left, found work on a ranch, lied about my age, and learned everything I could about cattle and horses because I knew that skill was the only security I'd ever have." "Were you scared?" Lily asked. "Terrified, but more scared of staying, of spending my whole life being nobody's priority. At least on my own, I had agency. I could succeed or fail, but it would be my own doing." Margaret looked at Lily with an expression that carried both memory and gratitude. "That's why what you said in that courtroom about choice mattering more than blood, that hit me so hard. Because you understood something it took me decades to learn." Caleb's lessons were different but equally valuable. He taught Lily about numbers and negotiation, about dealing fairly with buyers and standing firm on price when you knew your cattle were worth it. He showed her how to maintain equipment, how to plan for drought years and flush years, how to balance risk and stability in an inherently unpredictable business. "The ranch will be yours someday," he said one evening when Lily was 13, the two of them reviewing the year's accounts in his office. "Yours and Margaret's jointly. We've had the papers drawn up legal and proper. When we're gone, Red Willow becomes yours to run or sell or do with as you see fit." Lily looked up from the ledger, stunned. "But I know you're my guardians, but I didn't think—" "You're our daughter," Caleb said firmly. "Not by blood, but by every choice that matters. This ranch is our legacy, and you're part of that. We want you to have something solid to build your life on, whether that life is here or somewhere else entirely." The weight of that gift, not just the land and cattle, but the trust and love it represented, settled over Lily like a blessing. "I want it to be here," she said quietly. "I want to keep Red Willow going, to build on what you've both created." "Then we'll teach you everything we know," Caleb said with satisfaction, "so that when the time comes, you'll be ready." School continued through those years, though Lily often chafed at sitting indoors when there was real work to be done at the ranch. Miss Cassidy proved to be an excellent teacher who recognized Lily's intelligence and pushed her harder than she pushed most students, assigning extra reading and more complex mathematics because she saw potential worth nurturing. "You're smart enough for college," Miss Cassidy said when Lily was 15, pulling her aside after class one day. "Have you thought about that? There are teaching colleges now that accept women, even schools back east that might offer scholarships." The idea both thrilled and terrified Lily. "I don't know if I want to leave the ranch." "You don't have to decide now, but keep your options open. Learn everything you can because education gives you choices. And Lily," Miss Cassidy's expression was earnest, "you've overcome circumstances that would have broken most people. Don't limit yourself now just because you're comfortable." That conversation stayed with Lily, gnawing at the edges of her contentment. She loved Red Willow, loved the work and the land and her family. But Miss Cassidy's words had planted a seed, the notion that the world was bigger than Dakota Territory, that there were other ways to make a difference beyond running a successful ranch. She brought it up one evening at dinner when she was 16, the three of them sitting around the kitchen table as they always did, the lamplight warm against the darkness outside. "Miss Cassidy thinks I should consider college," she said, watching their faces carefully for reaction. Margaret and Caleb exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Margaret nodded. "She's right. You're more than smart enough." "But the ranch will be here whether you go to college or not," Caleb said. "And honestly, having more education would only make you a better rancher if that's what you ultimately choose. Understanding broader economics, history, science, all of that applies to running an operation like this." "We don't want you to feel trapped here," Margaret added, her voice gentle. "You were trapped once by circumstances beyond your control. Now you have choices. We want you to explore them, even if that means leaving for a while." "You'd be all right with that?" Lily asked. "With me going away?" "We'd miss you terribly," Margaret admitted. "But we'd also be proud. Lily, you're our daughter, and a parent's job is to raise children who can stand on their own feet and make their own choices. If college is what you want, we'll support that. If you want to stay here and learn ranching full-time, we'll support that too, but the choice has to be yours." The conversation shifted something in Lily, opened a door she hadn't realized was closed. Over the next year, as she finished her schooling with Miss Cassidy and prepared for whatever came next, she found herself thinking not just about Red Willow, but about the broader world and her place in it. She was 17 when the idea crystallized, born from a conversation with a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch one autumn evening. Reverend Thomas had brought him out for dinner, a young minister named David Hartley who was touring the territory's isolated communities and had stories about children living in circumstances as desperate as Lily's had once been. "There are so many," he said over Margaret's pot roast, his expression troubled. "Children abandoned, orphaned, abused. The orphanages in the cities are overflowing, and out here in the territories there's often nowhere for them to go at all. They end up in situations like what you experienced, Miss Lily, passed around, unwanted, exploited." "What can be done?" Lily asked, her heart aching with recognition of that particular suffering. "There are people starting charitable homes," Hartley said, "places specifically for children, run by people who actually care about their welfare rather than just warehousing them. But it takes resources and commitment and people who understand what these children need." After he left, Lily sat on the porch in the cooling night air, thinking about that frightened 8-year-old standing alone on a dusty trail. Thinking about all the other children in similar circumstances, waiting for someone to stop, to choose them, to offer them the kind of second chance she'd been given. "I want to do that," she said when Margaret came out to join her. "Not right away, but eventually. I want to create a place for children like I was. A real home, not an institution. Somewhere they can heal and learn and become whoever they're meant to be." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then reached over and took Lily's hand. "That's a beautiful dream, and knowing you, you'll make it real." "I'd need education for that, to know how to run such a place properly, to understand finance and law and child development. Maybe that's why Miss Cassidy kept pushing me toward college." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe she just recognized someone capable of more than one path and wanted to make sure you knew you had options." They sat in comfortable silence, looking out over the ranch that had become home, and Lily felt the future opening up before her, not as a single narrow road, but as a network of possibilities, all of them valid, all of them hers to choose. The decision to attend college came gradually, not as a sudden break, but as a natural evolution. There was a teaching college in Rapid City that had started accepting female students, and Miss Cassidy helped Lily prepare an application that highlighted her unusual background and her aspirations. When the acceptance letter arrived in the spring of her 18th year, the pride on Caleb and Margaret's faces was almost overwhelming. 2 years, Lily said as they sat around the kitchen table, the letter spread before them. "I'd be gone 2 years studying education and administration and whatever else they can teach me. Then I'd come back and start planning the children's home. Maybe here on Red Willow land. We've got space, and it would be good for children to grow up learning ranch skills alongside book learning." We could build a separate house, Caleb said, already thinking practically. Large enough for maybe 10 or 12 children, with space for house parents and staff. Close enough to the main house that you'd have support, but far enough for appropriate boundaries. And we'd help, Margaret added firmly. Not running it, that would be your project, but supporting it. Teaching skills, providing resources, being there when you need backup. The plan took shape through the summer as Lily prepared to leave for college. She worked the ranch harder than ever, storing up memories of this place and these people against the homesickness she knew would come. She learned everything Caleb and Margaret could teach her about managing money, about legal structures for charitable organizations, about the practical realities of building something from nothing. The day she left for Rapid City in early September, standing beside the wagon with her trunk packed and her heart torn between excitement and grief at leaving, Margaret pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You're going to do remarkable things," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You already have, just by surviving and thriving and becoming who you are. But this next chapter, helping children the way you were helped, that's going to be your legacy." "Red Willow is my legacy too," Lily said, pulling back to look at both of them. "This place, you two, everything you've taught me, I'm not leaving that behind. I'm building on it." Caleb rested a hand on her shoulder, his gray eyes bright with unshed tears. "We know. And we'll be here when you come back, ready to help you build whatever comes next." The 2 years in Rapid City were transformative. Lily studied voraciously, learning pedagogy and child psychology, administration and law, everything she could absorb about how to create and run an institution dedicated to children's welfare. She apprenticed at the local orphanage, seeing both what worked and what failed, understanding the difference between warehousing children and actually helping them heal and grow. She also discovered she had a gift for fundraising and advocacy. When she spoke about her own experience, the abandonment, the rescue, the transformation that came from being truly wanted, people listened and opened their wallets. By the time she completed her studies, she'd already secured pledges for nearly half the cost of building the children's home she envisioned. She returned to Red Willow Ranch in the summer of 1894, 20 years old and armed with education, experience, and unshakable determination. Caleb and Margaret met her at the train station in Redemption Creek, and the reunion was everything Lily had dreamed about during lonely nights in her dormitory. "Welcome home," Margaret said, and those 2 words carried the weight of everything they meant to each other. The next year was a whirlwind of planning and building. They selected a site on Red Willow land with good water access and views of the distant hills, close enough to the main house for support, but separated enough to give the children's home its own identity. Caleb hired builders and Lily oversaw every detail: large bedrooms with space for 4 children each, a common room for gathering and learning, a kitchen designed for teaching cooking skills, a barn for learning animal care. "What will you call it?" Margaret asked one evening as they reviewed architectural plans. Lily didn't hesitate. "Second Chance Ranch, because that's what it is, a second chance for children who thought they'd run out of chances." The first children arrived in the spring of 1895, 3 siblings who'd been living rough in Rapid City after their parents died of influenza. They were wary and frightened, defensive and hurting, and Lily recognized herself in every carefully guarded expression. "This is your home now," she told them that first day, crouching down to meet the youngest child's eyes. "Not temporary, not conditional. You belong here, and we're going to help you remember what it feels like to be safe." More children came gradually, never more than 12 at a time, because Lily had learned that quality of care mattered more than quantity of beds. She hired staff carefully, people who understood trauma and patience, who could be firm without being cruel and nurturing without being overbearing. Margaret taught writing lessons and ranch skills. Caleb managed the financial side and occasionally taught mathematics to older children who showed aptitude. By the time Lily turned 22, Second Chance Ranch was thriving, with children healing and growing and eventually moving on to adoptive families or independent lives, their time at the ranch having given them the foundation they needed. Success stories filtered back: a boy who'd become a skilled carpenter, a girl attending normal school to become a teacher, siblings who'd stayed together and started a small farm of their own. It was late summer when Walter Crane appeared at Red Willow again, nearly 13 years after that first disastrous visit. He was grayer now, more weathered, and he approached with visible uncertainty. "Miss Lily," he said when she came to meet him, having been alerted by one of the ranch hands. I know I have no right to be here, but I heard about what you've done. The children's home. I wanted to see it, and to see you. To know that my sister's daughter became someone who does good in this world. Lily studied him carefully, this man who shared her blood, but was essentially a stranger. She saw genuine admiration in his eyes, and something that might have been regret for opportunities missed. You can visit, she said finally. You can see Second Chance Ranch and meet some of the children if they're comfortable with it. But understand something. Caleb and Margaret Holt are my parents in every way that matters. You're my uncle by blood, and I'm willing to acknowledge that connection, but it doesn't change where my loyalty lies. I wouldn't expect it to, Crane said quietly. They did what I should have done. They were there when you needed family. I just want to know you a little, if you're willing. And maybe, he hesitated, then continued, maybe to tell you about your mother, about who she was before life got hard for her. Over the next few days, Walter Crane visited Red Willow and shared stories of Lily's mother as a young woman, her laugh, her dreams, her kindness. He told Lily about their childhood, about the family she'd never known, about the circumstances that had separated him from his sister all those years ago. It was painful and healing in equal measure, filling in gaps in Lily's history that she hadn't known were empty. When he left, promising to write and visit occasionally if she was willing, Lily felt a piece of her past settle into place. She would never be his daughter, would never see him as a parent, but having some connection to her mother's memory, some understanding of where she'd come from, that felt important in a way she hadn't expected. How are you feeling? Margaret asked that evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the ranch that had become so much more than either of them had imagined. Complete, Lily said simply. I know where I came from now. Both the blood family that couldn't be there and the chosen family that was. I know who I am and what I'm meant to do. And I know that none of it would have been possible if a quiet rancher hadn't stopped on a dusty trail 12 years ago and given a desperate child a choice. Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. You've become everything we hoped for and more. This ranch, she gestured to encompass both Red Willow and Second Chance. This is legacy. Real legacy. Not just land and cattle, but lives changed, children saved, futures created. Caleb emerged from the house carrying 3 glasses of lemonade, settling into his chair with a satisfied sigh. 23 children through Second Chance in just 3 years, he said, and the word's spreading. We got another inquiry today from a county official in Montana asking about our methods. Maybe we need to think bigger, Lily said, the idea forming even as she spoke. Not just Second Chance here, but training programs for people who want to start similar homes elsewhere. Sharing what we've learned, helping create a network of places where unwanted children can find families and futures. Now that, Margaret said with a grin, is thinking like someone who was raised by ambitious people. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged, 3 people bound not by blood, but by choices made and kept, by commitment proven through years of showing up and staying and building something worth keeping. Lily thought about that 8-year-old standing alone on a trail, about all the miles traveled between that moment and this one, about every decision and chance and act of courage that had led to this porch, this family, this life dedicated to ensuring other children found what she'd found. She thought about the question Judge Morrison had asked her all those years ago. Where did she belong? And she knew the answer with absolute certainty. She belonged here, with these people, doing this work. Not because she had no other options, but because she'd chosen this path deliberately, with full knowledge of what it cost and what it offered. She belonged to herself first, secure in her own identity and worth. But she also belonged to this family she'd built with Caleb and Margaret, this partnership of equals who'd taken a terrified child and helped her become a woman capable of offering other children the same transformation. Thank you, she said quietly, the words insufficient but necessary. For everything, for stopping, for choosing me, for building this life with me. Thank you, Caleb responded, for trusting us when you had every reason not to, for becoming who you are, for taking what we could offer and building something even bigger from it. Margaret reached over and took Lily's hand, and Caleb's, creating a circle of connection between the three of them. "This is what family looks like," she said. "Not perfect, not conventional, but real. Built on choice and commitment and love that doesn't need to shout to be heard." As the years continued to unfold, Second Chance Ranch grew and evolved. Lily eventually married a kind veterinarian named Thomas, who understood her commitment to the children and shared her vision for expanding the work. They had children of their own, 2 biological sons and 3 adopted daughters, all of them growing up understanding that family came in many forms, and love wasn't limited by biology. Caleb and Margaret aged gracefully, remaining active in ranch operations, and the children's home well into their 60s, their partnership as strong in old age as it had been in youth. They watched with pride as Lily's vision spread beyond Red Willow, as other communities started their own children's homes using the models and methods she'd developed, as the territorial and eventually state governments began implementing better protections for abandoned and orphaned children. On the 20th anniversary of that day on the dusty trail, Lily stood in front of the main building at Second Chance Ranch with a bronze plaque ready to mount. It bore a simple inscription she'd labored over for weeks before finding the right words. "In memory of every child who has ever felt unwanted, and in honor of every person who chooses to stop, to see, to care. Family is not always born. Sometimes it is built, one choice at a time." Caleb and Margaret stood beside her as she unveiled the plaque, their presence as solid and reassuring as it had been that first day. Around them clustered current residents of Second Chance Ranch, former residents who'd come back for the ceremony, staff members and supporters, and community members who'd been touched by the work being done here. 20 years ago, Lily said to the assembled crowd, her voice steady and clear, "I learned that the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for the best things we do. I was abandoned and terrified, and I was also given the greatest gift, the chance to be chosen, to be wanted, to become part of a family that taught me my worth wasn't contingent on blood or convenience, but inherent in simply being human." She looked at Caleb and Margaret, these 2 people who'd transformed her life through the simple act of stopping when they could have ridden past, of offering choices when they could have made assumptions, of staying when it got hard instead of walking away. "Every child who comes through these doors receives what I received, the knowledge that they matter, that they deserve love and stability and a future full of possibilities. That's the legacy of Red Willow Ranch and Second Chance Ranch. That's what happens when people choose to build family instead of just accepting the family they're given." The applause was warm and genuine, but what mattered most to Lily was the look in Caleb and Margaret's eyes, pride and love and satisfaction at seeing the child they'd rescued become a woman who dedicated her life to rescuing others. As the sun set that evening over the ranch that had been home for 2 decades, Lily sat on the porch with her husband Thomas on one side and her parents on the other, watching her children play with the current residents of Second Chance, all of them running free and laughing and secure in the knowledge that they were wanted. She thought about that terrified child on the trail, about the man who'd stopped and offered water, about the woman who'd defended her fiercely in courtrooms and kitchens alike. She thought about every choice made and kept, every moment of commitment that had built this life, this family, this legacy of choosing to love beyond obligation. And she understood, with the clarity that comes from years of reflection and growth, that being abandoned had been the worst thing that ever happened to her. But it had also led to the best thing, finding people who taught her that the truest family is the one you build through choice and commitment and unconditional acceptance. She'd been lost, and she'd been found. She'd been broken, and she'd healed. She'd been unwanted, and she'd been chosen. And now she spent her days ensuring that other lost, broken, unwanted children had the same chance at transformation. That was the gift Caleb and Margaret had given her. Not rescue, but choice. Not pity, but partnership. Not charity, but genuine family. And Lily had taken that gift and multiplied it 100-fold, creating ripples of healing that would extend far beyond her own lifetime. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, Lily leaned back in her chair and smiled. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because circumstances had forced her here, but because she'd chosen this life deliberately and built it brick by brick alongside people who'd proven again and again that love was a verb, not just a feeling. She was home. She was found. She was family. And she was helping others discover the same truth she'd learned on a dusty trail 20 years ago, that sometimes the people who stop, who see, who choose to stay, they become the truest family of all. The story that had begun with abandonment ended with belonging. The child who'd been left behind had become the woman who ensured no child would be left behind again. And the ranch that had given one lost girl a second chance had become a beacon of hope for countless others, all of them learning what Lily had learned, that family isn't about who you start with, it's about who stays, who chooses you, and who you choose in return. That was the legacy of Red Willow and Second Chance Ranch. That was the triumph of choice over circumstance, of love over obligation, of building family rather than just accepting what biology provided. And it all started with one man stopping on a trail when he could have ridden past, one woman opening her home when she could have closed her door, and one child brave enough to trust when every experience had taught her not to. From that single moment of choice, an entire lifetime of purpose had been born. And that, Lily knew as she sat surrounded by the family she'd built and the children she was helping to heal, that was everything.